So all the way through this Moodle lesson, we've been talking about getting gas into the lungs or out of the lungs. But we haven't talked about what happens once the gas is in at the level of the alveolus, and consequently what we need to now talk about is gas exchange, which will allow us to look at how we get oxygen into the body and get carbon dioxide back out. So when we've talked about the movement of gas from the atmosphere into the lungs, we've really been talking about something called bulk flow. So the bulk movement of gas, say, down the respiratory airways all the way down to the alveoli. This is bulk flow. But when we get to the actual alveolus itself, that gas needs to then diffuse either into the bloodstream. This is the blood here. Blood. And this is the alveolus here. It needs to either diffuse into the bloodstream or back out from it. So in the respiratory zone, gas diffuses across the respiratory membrane. So we move via bulk flow when we're in the conducting zone, but via diffusion in the respiratory zone. So basically we have air or gas in the alveolus. The first thing it has to do is cross the layer of liquid that was lining these epithelial cells. So we'll make the gas red now. It has to cross over these this lining liquid. It then which is called the alveolar fluid. It then has to cross over the respiratory membrane, which you'll recall is made up of the type 1 cell, the fused basement membrane, and then the endothelial cell, until it can get actually into the blood. So the direction in which gas flows, whether it be oxygen or carbon dioxide, depends on the relative concentration of the gas in the alveoli compared to the bloodstream. So really gas is going to travel from a high concentration to a low concentration, so whether it goes this way or this way will be dependent on the relative concentrations of gas either side. And we call these relative concentrations of gas partial pressures, which is denoted by a P. So we've got partial pressure of oxygen there and partial pressure of carbon dioxide. It's not equivalent to not strictly equivalent to concentration, but for the purposes of this unit, you can think of it as being pretty similar. So let's have a look at how this happens. The movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the respiratory membrane is influenced by a number of factors. So let's just draw this up again. So we've got, say we've got our alveolus here, lined by our type 1 cell predominantly. And then we've got our fused basement membrane in between, bit of a fused basement membrane. And then we've got our endothelial cell. Maybe we'll make a nice big. We've got our endothelial cell wrapping its way around the edge of our blood vessel, which is going to have some little red blood cells in it. Okay, a couple of different shaped red blood cells in there. So we've got our alveolus here and our capillary there. The movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide across this respiratory membrane is influenced by a number of factors. Firstly, the partial pressure difference or partial pressure gradient that exists between here. So if in the alveolus we've got lots of oxygen, a high partial pressure of oxygen, compared to a lower partial pressure of oxygen in the capillaries, you can see that gas or oxygen is going to move or diffuse into the capillary. But if we've got a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the capillaries and a low partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolus, carbon dioxide will diffuse out. But that's not the only thing that determines how much gas is going to diffuse. The other thing that determines how it will diffuse is how soluble the gas is in the alveolar fluid and then in plasma. So how soluble will it be in water? So for instance, carbon dioxide is much more soluble than oxygen. So it's 20 times more soluble than oxygen in water, meaning that carbon dioxide can cross the barrier more readily. The other thing that changes the diffusion of gas is the structural characteristics of the respiratory membrane, and we'll talk about this in the next slide. But if the distance between the inside of the capillary and the inside of the alveolus is large, it's going to limit the amount of gas exchange that can occur. And the fourth thing that we'll need to talk about just very briefly is that we can only get diffusion of gases from the blood to the capillaries if both the blood from the blood to the alveoli, if both the capillaries and the alveoli are functioning together. So this is called matching of the alveolar ventilation, where our gas goes, with the pulmonary blood perfusion, so where our blood goes. Let's have a look at these in a bit more detail. So let's start by looking at gas diffusion at the alveoli. So here we've got an artery turning into a vein. So we've got our pulmonary artery up this side and our pulmonary vein coming down the other side. Of course, our pulmonary arteries come from the heart and it's carrying deoxygenated blood. We can see it's deoxygenated because the level of oxygen is 40 millimeters of mercury, and this is relatively low compared to the level of oxygen in the alveolus. So here's our alveolus here. You can see the level of oxygen here is 100 millimeters of mercury. So we're basically going from a very high concentration of oxygen in the alveolus to a very low concentration of oxygen in the blood, meaning that oxygen diffuses down its concentration gradient. In contrast, in this deoxygenated blood that's coming to the lungs via the pulmonary artery, we have a relatively high concentration of carbon dioxide. So you can see it's 45, measured in millimeters of mercury, as a partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the pulmonary arteries. And this is a little bit higher than what we see in the alveolus, which is only 40. Now, it's not as big a concentration difference. So we've got a slightly higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the artery, and a slightly lower concentration of carbon dioxide in the alveolus. So we've still got a concentration gradient to diffuse down, but it's nowhere near as big as the concentration gradient that we have for oxygen. So diffusion of oxygen from the alveolus to the pulmonary capillaries occurs because of the large difference in the partial pressure. But diffusion of carbon dioxide from the capillaries into the alveoli has less of a concentration gradient to follow, a small difference in partial pressure. But even despite that, an equivalent amount of oxygen diffuses at the same time as the carbon dioxide diffuses. And the reason for this is that despite this very small concentration difference, as I mentioned before, carbon dioxide is 20 times more soluble than oxygen, so it diffuses more readily. So we get equal swapping of the amounts of carbon dioxide and oxygen despite the lower concentration or partial pressure difference for carbon dioxide. So that's what happens at the alveoli. By the time we leave the alveoli, our blood has exactly the same partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide as the alveolus did. So you can see our partial pressure in the pulmonary vein is 100 millimeters of mercury for oxygen and 40 millimeters of mercury for carbon dioxide. It's now time to get that to the tissues. So at the tissues, so we've gone through the alveolus, we've picked up all of our oxygen and gotten rid of our carbon dioxide. At the tissues, we want to offload that oxygen. By the time we get to the tissues, we've lost a little bit of our oxygen level already. We've got about 95 millimeters of mercury of oxygen in that arterial blood, and we need that to get over into the tissue. So a high concentration of oxygen in the blood, a really low concentration of oxygen in the tissue, so you can see it's 40 millimeters of mercury, and a high pressure difference, a large difference in the oxygen partial pressures to allow this gradient and therefore the quick diffusion of oxygen. On the opposite hand, our carbon dioxide, with a partial pressure of 40 in this arterial blood, is a little bit lower than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissue, and we get a small gradient for the movement of carbon dioxide out. Again, it's not as big a concentration difference or bigger difference in the partial pressures, but because carbon dioxide is 20 times more soluble than oxygen, it can still diffuse out at the same rate as as oxygen diffuses in. So the diffusion of gases depends on not only the concentration or partial pressure differences, but also on the structure of the respiratory membrane. So the efficiency with which gases diffuse depends on how wide the respiratory membrane is. So again, here's another little picture that I've taken on the electron microscope, and you can see this is inside of a capillary here. It's taken a section of the capillary with a little red blood cell shown here, folded up as it squeezes its way through the pulmonary capillary. And you can see here, we've got the 3 layers of the respiratory membrane, with the alveolus being on this side here. Just a little section of it taken. We can see a really narrow barrier for gas exchange here, so a really narrow respiratory membrane. But in some disease states, this respiratory membrane increases. So if we've got we'll do it again in the same colours, if we've got our capillary with our red blood cell in it, and for some unknown reason we've got some accumulation of fluid in the extracellular matrix, it might mean that the gap between the alveolus and the capillary widens. And if we've got an increased respiratory membrane now, there's an increased diffusion distance, to get gases from the alveolus to the capillary or vice versa. So the diffusion efficiency during normal health is dependent on a really thin membrane for gas exchange, and this allows for rapid gas exchange to occur. But the other thing that it's dependent on is how much surface area we have. So we talked about the fact that we had 300 million alveoli, and within each of these alveoli there's a large surface area, or it contributes to the large surface area for gas exchange. If we lose some of these alveoli, and we have a fewer number or larger alveoli with less of them, it decreases the surface area available for gas exchange and therefore limits the exchange that can take place. The last thing I really quickly want to touch on was this thing called ventilation-perfusion coupling. And basically what it means is that we want to match where the gas is flowing in the alveoli to where the blood is flowing in the blood. Sorry, where the blood is flowing in the capillaries. So here we've got, maybe our gas might come down here, and for some unknown reason this might be blocked off. So our gas may only get down to this group of alveoli here. In order to have gas exchange occur, we'd want to make sure that we increase the radius of the vessels that are coming along this way so we can quickly pick up the oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide. But the body may constrict the vessels coming to this direction so we don't waste blood flow going to alveoli that don't have the adequate gas there. So efficient gas exchange requires matching gas flow, as is the case here, with blood flow, which is called ventilation-perfusion coupling.